Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon to folks as well. We'll give everyone a minute to get signed on here and then we'll get underway. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to WaterNow Alliance's webinar, Expanding Frontline Communities' Access to Federal Funding. My name is Caroline Cook. I'm the Water Policy Director at WaterNow, and we are delighted that you've joined us. So before we get started, I'll quickly review some of the functionality of the Zoom. So on the left is the general chat icon where you can ask questions related to any technical problems. Do keep in mind that everyone can see those messages. And my colleague, Jesse, thanks Jesse for running our slides and our tech, can help you with those directly. You can also submit your content related questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A tool. And our panel may respond to your questions in writing, so do keep an eye out for those in the Q&A box. And I'll note too that we'll have a recording of the webcast that we'll share with everyone when the link is available. And so for our speakers today, I am honored to be joined by Shada Esnajari, Director of River Network's Drinking Water Program, Yasmin Zayarpour, Director of Equity and Climate Resilience at PolicyLink, and Shannon Spurlock, Senior Researcher for Public Policy and Practice Uptake at Pacific Institute. So we'll take a quick look at today's agenda. First, I'll briefly provide an overview of WaterNow. Then I'll turn it over to Shada and Yasmin to walk us through the opportunities and challenges with the State Revolving Funds and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. From there, we'll hear from Shannon about the types of innovative multi-benefit projects that are eligible for SRF dollars. And I'll give a snapshot of WaterNow resources that are there to help you navigate the SRFs, as well as other complementary federal funding and financing options. And of course, at the end, we'll leave time for Q&A. So just a couple more housekeeping items here. Our next WaterNow Water Webinar Wednesday program will be held August 17th. So this virtual forum will feature real-world case studies of equitable distributed infrastructure projects presented by on-the-ground implementers, as well as an overview of an equitable green infrastructure framework. So registration is open for that program currently. Thanks, Jesse, for putting that link in the chat. And we hope you'll be able to join to build on today's discussion. For those interested in preparing for a leadership role at a utility guided by principles of community, sustainability, and diversity, we invite you to apply for the Transformative Water Leadership Academy. The 10-month program prepares the next generation of utility leaders to meet water challenges through sustainable community leadership practices. Applications for that program are open now through September 15th, and there's a link in the chat for that as well. So one last housekeeping item. We would love to hear from you all on your feedback about today's program. So be sure to fill out the survey at the close of the webinar, and we'll share that chat with you at the end, in the chat at the end. So without further ado, for those viewers who aren't familiar with our organization, WaterNow is a nonprofit network of local water decision makers advancing sustainable, affordable, equitable, and climate resilient water solutions across the One Water spectrum. So sustainable is a term that can mean many different things. For WaterNow, it means providing safe, healthy, and affordable water services for people while preserving the integrity of water resources and the environment for future generations. And equity is also a term that can mean different things for different groups. For WaterNow, it means universal access to secure, affordable, safe, and healthy drinking water and wastewater and stormwater services. And for us, equitable water infrastructure investments should support the long-term sustainability of our waterways, water systems, and utilities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shada and Yasmin.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to start us off, and Yasmin and I are going to kind of go back and forth talking about giving a little bit of background on the state revolving funds and the opportunity with the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as bill, also referred to as IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So no shortage of acronyms in this conversation. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to do just a little bit of level setting and talking about the context and how we are thinking and talking about water infrastructure investment. The title of this presentation is really focused on frontline access to federal infrastructure dollars. So I want to name a few things up front here. So why are we talking about water infrastructure in the first place? For one thing, we know that our water infrastructure is out of date. It was built decades ago. It is overbuilt for the communities that it is serving now, and it is in desperate need of repair. I'm sure many of us have heard this before, but in particular, we know that infrastructure investment has historically not gone to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities with predominantly people of color. We also know that this is happening during an ongoing issue with water affordability. I believe it's Manny Teodoro who says water is both underpriced and unaffordable. And we know that roughly a third of US families cannot afford their water bill. What often ends up happening when infrastructure dollars are not accessed by a water system in need is that the cost for investing in water infrastructure gets put back on the ratepayer, among other means for maintaining water delivery. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So ultimately, a conversation around water infrastructure is one around water equity. So we also know that federal investment in water infrastructure has declined rapidly. And so states and municipalities and water systems are responsible for making up that difference. And as I said, that ultimately gets put back onto the ratepayer and disproportionately impacts low income, small communities, and predominantly BIPOC communities. So ultimately, water infrastructure investment is necessary for water equity. Some of the things that Caroline outlined at the beginning of this call around access, affordability, safety, and resilience. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what is equitable investment in water infrastructure? And I know Caroline talked about WaterNow's definition. We at River Network developed one in the development of our equitable water infrastructure toolkit. So some of the principles are directed by the community toward public health and clean, safe, affordable, and accessible water. Supports low income and communities of color most at risk from environmental harms and historic lack of investment, and supports the long-term sustainability of our waterways, water systems, and utilities. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So what are the state revolving funds? I'm sure many of you are familiar to a certain extent with them. They do make up two different sources. So we've got the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and then the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Both were created under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act decades ago, but they do make up the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure. The money flows, Congress appropriates funding to the US EPA. US EPA distributes that funding to state and tribal agencies. In the case of tribal SRF administration, I believe the funds actually still sit at the US EPA, but there's more of an ongoing relationship there. And then ultimately, these dollars flow to local communities to support implementation of local water infrastructure projects, be that investing in water treatment or green infrastructure. So we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, actually. So as I mentioned, there are two different kinds of SRFs. The clean water SRFs focus on water infrastructure improvement projects to ensure compliance with the Clean Water Act. Example projects include wastewater system improvements, any maintenance that needs ongoing maintenance that's needed, protection of watersheds, implementation of green infrastructure to address water quality and stormwater. Drinking water SRFs, a focus on improvement in drinking water systems under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So example projects here are things like improved drinking water treatment to address new or emerging contaminants, water infrastructure or pipe replacement and installations. So if there are leaks, ensuring that water is actually, there's no water loss and it's actually flowing to the customers. And then water storage, so there is a consistent flow of accessible drinking water flowing to customers. That's just a handful of many of the projects and things that the SRFs fund. We'll get into some other things like set-asides later, but these are the kinds of projects that are covered under the two main SRFs. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to pass it to Yasmin.
Thanks, Jada. So one of the things that's come up when we look at how state revolving funds have been distributed in the past is that they have often not gone to the communities that are in most need of support. So there's a historic lack of investment in water infrastructure, especially in small and rural communities and in racially diverse communities. And this is research that's coming out of EPIC, our friends there. They have a few different more recent reports too on clean water SRFs as well, and they're finding the same type of thing. So a big concern has been, how can we change sort of the way that the rules of the game are established so that the most underserved communities do get access to these state revolving funds? So we wanted to spend a little bit of time, next slide, talking about some of the barriers that we've identified in terms of equitable distribution of state revolving funds. So the first is that many places have limited financial capacity to access and pay back loans. So this is true both of states and for utilities and communities. A second limitation is that the limited technical capacity to plan for projects and to apply for state revolving funds. It's a pretty lengthy process. So especially in the case of underserved communities, they're lacking the technical capacity and sometimes the staff to be able to apply for these. A third limitation that's been brought up are some of the administrative barriers. So for example, the way that quote unquote disadvantaged communities, which is the shorthand is DAC, is defined in the case of drinking water state revolving funds, and then affordability criteria in the case of clean water state revolving funds, that can affect how the money flows. So if you have like an overly expansive definition of DAC, for example, the funding may be going to a lot of communities and may not be targeted to underserved communities. The flip is, if, for example, your definition of DAC is based solely on population, like under 10,000 folks. So, what am I trying to say? Under 10,000 population. Yeah, thanks, Jada. then it might not take into account racial and economic inequity within that service area. In addition, there's lack in transparency for the intended use plan review in a lot of states, which is the main way that communities can give feedback on the types of projects that are being funded through state revolving funds. And then the fourth category of barrier that we wanted to highlight is the lack of awareness and voice in the process. And this is true for communities. So oftentimes when we talk about state revolving funds, we talk about communities, and sometimes what we mean is the utilities or service providers that are servicing the communities. And so I just want to make that distinction between service providers and the communities that they are taking care of. So if, we're going to go through the next few barriers, first talking about how some of these have been addressed so far at the federal level. So on the next slide, and then we'll go one more. So there's a few ways in which the government has already tried to reduce the barriers. Shada, do you want to quickly introduce the IIJA?
Yeah, I can pop in here. Yeah, and I'm going to refer to it as bill going forward, because that is what it's called as the law. IIJA was legislation that was proposed. It was passed in November of 2021. And this allocates historic levels of funding. So I already said that the SRFs are the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure, but we in the advocacy community, as well as I'm sure the utility and states, have all known that this is not enough funding, a lot of it due to the decrease in funding over the last several decades. So this funding that was allocated as part of bill, roughly $43 billion to the SRFs, happens on top of that annual base funding. So the clean water and the drinking water SRF are still going to receive the normal level of funding, but over the next 5 years, there's a major bump in funding, and in particular in the first couple of years. So yeah, that's why we're talking about this today. There's a big opportunity, and within bill, there are several provisions to support states in increasing access and allocating funds for communities and issues most in need. There's specific set-asides for lead service line replacement, provisions around disadvantaged communities, reductions in barriers for states for accessing these funds. We'll get into that in the next few slides. And I just do want to emphasize this point, and we'll re-emphasize it later. But what is included in bill did not just happen. Congress wasn't just like, hey, we think we need to allocate more money to the SRFs. This is due to like several years of an advocacy strategy. So we have the advocacy community to thank for moving this and hopefully navigating implementation as well and keeping the pressure on. We can go to the next slide.
Sorry, the one thing I wanted to add to was, so that 43 billion, that's of the $50 billion that was given to Office of Water EPA for water infrastructure. So it's a pretty sizable chunk that's going to be distributed as state revolving funds, which is why we're focusing so much on it. All right, so what did the federal government to reduce some of these financial barriers that we talked about? First, the fact that they just put $43 billion over the next 5 years on top of the regular amount that's appropriated for SRFs is a pretty big deal. This was, people will say a once in a generation, hopefully it won't be. Hopefully we'll see our federal government put more money towards water infrastructure. We desperately need it. But this was a pretty significant amount. Another point is that it reduced the state match from 20% to 10%, at least for the first 2 years. And in the case of lead service line replacement and emerging contaminants, it waived the match altogether, which is really good news. Another function is that 49% is to be distributed as grants or forgivable loans to disadvantaged communities, underserved communities. And this was again, to Shada's earlier point, this was a big push by the advocacy community. I know within the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, we were pushing for 100% out as grants or forgivable loans. we'll take the 49%. But this is really good because in the case of a lot of communities that can't pay back the loans, this enables them to still improve their water infrastructure, hopefully. All right, next slide. In terms of reducing some of the administrative barriers, not technically part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, but part of the Biden-Harris administration, the Justice 40 initiative, 40% of the benefits of this set of state revolving funds has to go to disadvantaged communities. So there's some discussion of how we'll measure the benefits, but that's still pretty significant. And then the other thing we wanted to flag is that EPA Office of Water has done an incredible job of putting out guidance, a couple different guidances, but the first is for states to revise their definition of disadvantaged community and affordability criteria in order to better target the communities that are in need. So we're very grateful to the EPA for that.
Yeah, so we also know, one thing I want to say, we're talking about these as separate issues, but they really do feed into each other. And, you know, like you can't really have one without the other. If you have additional funding, but you don't have the technical capacity to go after those funds, you're still stuck. So anyway, increasing technical capacity. So as Yasmin already highlighted, EPA is really playing a proactive role and stepping in within the boundaries of their jurisdiction to support states and EPA regions and advocates in understanding and navigating the guidance. One thing is that, so technical assistance, a technical assistance set aside of 2% of the loan was already in place for the drinking water SRF. So that means you could use 2% of your loan toward hiring or working with an organization or individuals who would support you in actually navigating the bureaucratic process of going after the loan, pulling together a needs assessment, and figuring out the whole project design and implementation, essentially. With Bill, the Clean Water SRF now has a provision for 2% of the loan can be used for technical assistance. So this is huge. We know that this is specifically an issue for smaller and low resource water systems. So just because they don't have the staff or the funding to navigate the system. EPA is also supporting the development of more environmental finance centers, which actually deliver that technical assistance and help water systems navigate the SRF application and implementation process. So development of more of these, this RFP went out earlier this spring, so it's yet to be determined where those EFCs will be located, who will be receiving the funding, but this is a big chunk of funding toward technical assistance that didn't exist previously. And then EPA has also just released guidance on finding technical assistance reports. So that's that report, Building a Better America, which tells you about all the different programs. There's also a website on EPA's website. There's a way to find, based on your region, technical assistance providers. So they're churning out information and dollars in some cases as well. We can go to the next slide. And so overall, this is a part of EPA's push and heeding of the call for more guidance, more of a hands-on approach, and increasing access to information and engagement of community in this process. Because ultimately, as I said before, the way the dollars flow, they ultimately flow to the local level. These are very localized projects, and community voices who are impacted by lack of access to clean water, unaffordability, flooding, that sort of thing, have not historically been regularly engaged in the conversation. So EPA is really stepping up. We're really pleased with the folks at the Office of Water and the way that they're showing up, sharing, and listening. So they continue to provide ongoing guidance, information sessions, that sort of thing, and are looking for more feedback on ways that they can make things even clearer and provide even better resources for states and municipalities and advocates alike to navigate the system. And like I said, this is due to a strong advocacy strategy and a lot of asking for what we need and sometimes pushing for what we need. So we can go to the next slide.
So we've outlined a few of the different ways that some of these barriers are trying to be reduced at the federal level, whether through the Biden-Harris administration or through the EPA. Ultimately, it'll come down to the states. And so every state is going to have different types of barriers. And part of the work that Shada and I are doing is trying to do a lot of outreach to community groups and advocates to do the advocacy at the state level. So if we go to the next slide. So one of the challenges, for example, at the state level is something that's been raised often by community organizations that we work with, is that the intended use plan review. So this is the main way that a lot of people can give feedback on the projects that are planned for the year for the state, is not a very transparent process. It can be very technical and very time intensive. So a lot of folks that we work with often have difficulty figuring out where their IUP can be found, when the window of opportunity is to review it. And in some cases, it's a pretty short window, which doesn't give folks that are already pretty pressed in terms of their capacity a lot of time to do a full review. Additionally, there are broader system challenges in how SRFs are distributed and prioritized. So for example, as I mentioned before, the definition of disadvantaged community or DAC and the use of affordability criteria. In some cases, the existence of caps to how much a community can receive in terms of grants versus loans. And then in some cases, that upfront matching requirement. So even in the case of forgivable loans, something that advocates have brought up to us is that they're still required to put some money up front, and that'll be given back to them later, but they don't even have that initial money to be able to put up front. So we just wanted to spend a little bit of time quickly describing the work that we do to address these issues. So Shade and I work very closely together. Shade is from the River Network. I'm from PolicyLink. We have a 2-year civic engagement for equitable infrastructure project that River Networks is working with us on, where we're doing analyses of drinking water state revolving funds in California, Michigan, and Oregon, and then working with community partners in those states to do state level advocacy based on the analysis that we do. We also co-convene with Alliance for Great Lakes and EPIC, a monthly call called the State Revolving Fund State Advocate Forum. So this is really meant for advocates that are interested in learning more about state revolving funds and joining forces and pushing for more equitable distribution of these funds. We've also put a lot of work, and River Network especially has been doing a lot of work on trainings and primers. So you can definitely check out, there's a fundamentals of SRF training that River Network recently ran that was really good. Sorry, you can click through. And just as an example, on the bottom right, we have this sort of primer on state revolving funds that we created for really community groups and for advocates to be able to spread the word about the use of state revolving funds to help address some of their water infrastructure needs, because a lot of the communities that we work with have not benefited from state revolving funds in the past. And so there's a big need to educate and sort of spread awareness that this opportunity exists. So in terms of, we can go to the next slide, sorry. Reducing some of the barriers at the local level, some of the opportunities that we have for local leaders and utilities include just raising awareness in your state about the availability of bill SRF funding. The fact that at 49% will go out as grants is a really big deal. Sorry, Shada, I just realized this was your slide.
That's okay. I can pick it up if you want. And Danielle, I do see your question in the chat and recognize that this was a really high level interview, but hopefully some of these will address your question. But another component of or another opportunity at the local level is to increase community level engagement in the first place in water infrastructure decision making. This includes figuring out what the infrastructure need is, or water access and quality need is, and then moving toward the next bullet point, which is proposing projects. So what I was talking about earlier with technical assistance, that's really about navigating the SRF application process. They apply, the administering agency comes up with something called the intended use plan and a project prioritization list within that. And those are the projects that they intend to fund with SRF dollars for the year. So what we're suggesting here is proposing more or planning for more shovel-worthy projects. So the language used to be shovel-ready projects, and SRF projects that were primarily funded were ones where they already had the technical capacity and were ready to go, ready to start work on the project as soon as they had cash in hand with a loan in hand, and really a focus now on where is there really a big need and where are the gaps in the needs for capacity, technical understanding, whatever it is, in order to implement that project. And focusing again on those underserved communities, the small and rural communities, the communities of color, and low income communities in your state, and ensuring that those projects get onto the IUP process with supportive technical assistance in navigating the process in the first place. So yeah, just to kind of close it out, I just want to say the things that we have available to us at the federal level are pretty much set for right now. So the opportunity for advocacy there really is just, if there's additional clarification or information needed from EPA, Office of Water has our ear and is really looking to play a role. At the state level, it really is those administrative barriers, any confusion or lack of transparency around making this a more accessible process. And then at the local level, it really is bringing in community voice into the process and understanding where are they seeing a need, and helping them to build relationship with their municipal leaders, their water utilities, so that they are involved in the process. So we can go to the last slide. That rounds us out. We'll be around for more questions, but now we're going to hand it over to Shannon.
Great. Thank you so much, Shada and Yasmin. So welcome everyone. My name is Shannon and I am here on behalf of the Pacific Institute. And I'm going to start off just with a brief overview of how we fit into this equation. So we are a nonprofit working globally, and we are based in Oakland, California, with staff throughout the United States as well as abroad. We have three focus areas: nature-based solutions, water reuse and efficiency, and water and climate equity. Earlier this month, we launched our new water and climate equity strategy for the United States, and which we're very excited about this new push in that direction. This webinar is focused on state revolving funds and identifying potential pathways for innovative water structure, closely aligns with our focus areas, and we're excited to weigh in on this. At this point, I'm going to take us to the next slide. And we're going to dive deeper here and explore multi-benefit approaches and how integrating them into the water infrastructure projects can elevate and maximize the benefits for the communities in which those strategies and projects are planned and hopefully ultimately located. So, big picture here. What do we mean when we talk about a multi-benefit project, and why is it beneficial? So I'm just going to choose one example to highlight as an example, and we're going to look at stormwater capture and use. So currently, if a community is looking at stormwater capture and use as a potential SRF worthy project, that is actually an area that tends to be underfunded in a very much ongoing and studied way. And much of the economic analysis around the co-benefits that result from stormwater capture investments are often ignored and not really reflected in project costs. So through the Pacific Institute's research, we've been able to demonstrate that incorporating even a limited number of co-benefits dramatically improves the economic feasibility of stormwater projects. So specifically, what does that look like? Well, recently the Pacific Institute did a study and focused on 50 stormwater capture and use projects in California and wanted to understand what the ultimate levelized cost would be across that strategy. Well, when co-benefits were incorporated, the levelized cost of water decreased by 85%. And so it became more of a level playing field when you look at community-based and driven strategies, in this case, stormwater capture and use, and how, apples to apples, how they may compare with other strategies. In addition, this research demonstrated that scaling urban stormwater capture projects can help kind of capitalize on economies of scale and economies of scope, thus further benefiting the local communities in which they are sited. Next. So when we look at leveraging a multi-benefit approach and really trying to get all the benefits out of it that we're able to, one thing that is very compelling about incorporating this approach into water infrastructure projects is that it inherently takes into concern the considerations of the community where that investment or strategy is being considered. So just as water applications and treatments are fit for purpose in nature, so too is that multi-benefit framework, as it homes in on the needs of the end users. And this is something I think that actually really Shada and Yasmin really brought up in their presentations, is looking at that local voice. What is the project that may be included in that IUP, and how is that being driven? So these are 4 steps that really look at a basic outline of the multi-benefit framework. And there's a link there where you can, go to further look up the framework and this approach, and it will further spell out the pieces of each step. But I'm going to highlight 2 key things here as takeaways. One is that collaboration with stakeholders from across the spectrum, and I would say grassroots to grass tops, is important and inherent at every step of that process. It's important to understand how the project is being driven, who benefits, who the end users are, and how are the decisions being made, and how can they be institutionalized in a way that really puts equity at front and center in the communities where these projects are being considered. A second piece is that when you're looking at this and we think about, well, when we say co-benefits, how do we think about those? How can they be measured or quantified? In the work of the Pacific Institute, we really, came across 5 key theme buckets to think about co-benefits. And those would be looking at benefits as it relates to water, the quality and supply, energy, environment, people and community, and then risk and resilience. These are big picture kind of themes, and they're a great starting point for local communities to understand when thinking about incorporating a project, what are the multitude of ways in which their community can benefit and maximize the co-benefits that benefit everyone in the community, making it a place to live and thrive. Though this webinar is really focused on state revolving funds, I wanted to highlight the piece around multi-benefits, community-driven, informed decision-making, and actually how is that replicated in other funding mechanisms. So for example, with WIFIA and WaterSmart funding opportunities, they both have similar approaches in their eligibility and scoring criteria. The weighted scoring models provide further support for projects that incorporate a multi-benefit approach. And so this system of prioritization does go beyond these opportunities, and you see it across the United States at state level funding. Everything from the Colorado Water Plan grants, for example, to California's multi-benefit land repurposing program. There's a really great blog post written recently by the Environmental Defense Fund, and they looked at the multi-benefit land repurposing program in its inaugural year and noted that there was $110 million available, and requests came in for almost double that amount of funding. The 4 proposals that were successful in that funding program, they all came from critically overdrafted groundwater subbasins in the San Joaquin and Salinas valleys. But those proposals shared 3 key elements that set them apart and ultimately led to their success. One of them was that they each had a strong planning foundation that provided a leg up to each of them. 2, diverse partnerships, community partnerships were key in each of those proposals. And finally, each of those proposals was committed to generating multiple benefits. So I want to underscore this with that when you are thinking about shovel-worthy projects for SRF funding, think about how you can maximize those benefits for the local community in which they are planned. And I actually will move on to next a couple of case studies, and I want to highlight this. So these are 2 case studies that when you think about could benefit from funding from a state revolving fund. And in this first example is an example where the Pacific Institute worked with the city of Austin. And in Waller Creek, which is the community where this program is focused, we're really looking at I would say it was a very innovative rain capture program that looked at everything from water efficiency to flood mitigation, and then also water conservation. So the rain capture pilot program looked at an area and noted that this was an area where flooding often occurred, and that is there a way to mitigate the funding, increase water quality, and benefit the local community? And in doing so, this project was also very cognizant of the educational benefits that could come from such a rain capture program, and actually worked with a number of public property demonstration sites, including schools, to highlight the educational benefits and cultivate that next generation of water leaders. So on the slides here, you'll see these are some of the key benefits and things that were really driving this pilot program. But there are 2 other things to consider as well. And one of those is that the modeling simulations indicate that there will be measurable improvements in the hydrology and aquatic life of Austin streams by capturing rainfall and letting it soak in the ground with rain gardens and cisterns. So this is really a holistic approach that benefits the community in which it is located. And the final example before I hand this off is really looking at the role that affordable housing and places that seek to increase the capacity of families with lower income, what is the role that they can play? And I want to actually highlight the work of one of our partners, WaterNow Alliance, in working with Westminster, Colorado, and their affordable housing, high efficiency water fixture upgrades. This really had a number of key partners as well. But this project really looked at how can those who are most affected, frontline communities, by climate change, benefit from strategies that can help mitigate those negative effects. And so centering equity and affordability was one of the key drivers for Westminster's program. And this is reflected in their choosing of the site of a housing project called Orchard Crossings East. And this is a project-based Section 8 community that offers subsidized housing to income qualifying families. So the high efficiency water upgrades offered in this program were offered in multi-family affordable housing buildings free of charge. And one piece that is really pivotal in this, and it's highlighted in the outcomes here, is that not only do we see a reduction of water usage indoors, but also we see that kind of financial return on investment. Which, you know, helped garner wide support for this project. So the city of Westminster originally put in about $30,000 to this project, and their return was a cost savings of $65,000, which I feel is, you know, something a lot of municipalities want to experience when they think about solving community-wide issues. But what this did was the success in year one of this project was felt especially in year two, where the city capitalized on the fact that this program was viewed as universally successful. And thus the city of Westminster dedicated $100,000 to be funded as a capital improvement project to continue this work. So that actually covers my portion of this webinar, talking about how we can really use multi-benefits to think about appropriate projects and promote projects that are community driven. And with that, I will pass it off to Caroline.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And thank you, Shada and Yasmin, for that overview and those really good examples, Shannon. So to build off of our presentations so far, I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about WaterNow's cornerstone Tap into Resilience initiative. So TIR supports cities, towns, and water agencies in accelerating and scaling up their investments in all kinds of on-site, localized, and distributed systems, which provide those multiple benefits that Shannon was talking about, and we believe are those shovel-worthy types of projects for communities in most need of water infrastructure improvements. So through TIR, WaterNow creates opportunities for those large-scale capital investments in the decentralized infrastructure and helps communities understand how this expanded definition of water infrastructure can supplement conventional options in meeting drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater challenges. So Shada and Yasmin mentioned the need to really right-size these systems, and distributed strategies play a key role in that. So a key component of the campaign is the Tap into Resilience Toolkit. And the toolkit is an interactive online resource to help you explore, plan for, finance, and adopt localized infrastructure like the water use efficiency programs Shannon was talking about, green infrastructure, as well as on-site reuse and other examples. And so the toolkit contains a lot of self-guided modules to answer the financing, tax, accounting, and legal nuts and bolts questions in order to make these investments. So one of these modules is the Water Equity and Climate Resilience for Frontline Communities section. And this is tailored to communities facing the first and worst impacts of climate change, as we've been talking about today. So the module includes 6 main sections covering what we mean by when we say frontline communities and steps to centering those communities in decision-making, as we've all been talking about. Access to our story map of case studies deploying localized infrastructure to meet their water and climate challenges. An overview of how these localized strategies can help meet water challenges in our frontline communities. The importance of partnerships in these discussions, ways for avoiding water shutoffs on the affordability and access front, and then where we'll focus today, how to make equitable and affordable investments in these localized strategies. So as we've been focused on and heard from our panel, the state revolving funds are the major water infrastructure financing mechanism that we have available. And accessing these funds, as we've all been saying, is going to be an important path for frontline communities. But I just wanted to highlight, as we've heard and further detailed in the toolkit, that these SRF dollars can fund a wide variety of projects, and to focus in on the eligibility of green infrastructure, water use efficiency, and other environmentally innovative projects that are covered by what's called the Green Project Reserve, that requires at least 10% of the clean water SRF dollars a state receives to be spent on these green projects. Now, that's a floor, not a ceiling. At least 10%. States can spend more if they choose. So to encourage these types of projects, some states do offer additional subsidization for Green Project Reserve projects. So we heard about the 49% going out as grants or principal forgiveness. So on top of that, some states do also incentivize green projects with additional subsidization. For example, in Colorado, they offer 0.5% interest rate on loans where green projects are at least 20% of the total project. So again, these are supplementing other centralized options. If you're representing green projects, at least 20%, your interest rate is going to be 0.5%. Helps with the affordability, doesn't totally resolve all the barriers that Shada and Yasmin mentioned, but can be helpful. Another thing to note here is because these solutions are typically implemented with consumer incentive or direct install program, and in the instance of that Westminster example, that was a direct installation program. EPA guidance does explain that SRF dollars can be used for incentives and direct installs. So, of course, as Shada and Yasmin mentioned, each state implements these eligibilities differently. So it's going to be important to be familiar with your state's intended use plan and SRF policies. But at the federal level, there is guidance that explains incentives and direct installations are eligible. So in addition to the SRFs, there are these other federal programs that can fund investments in localized infrastructure, and you can see these on the slide, and Shannon mentioned a few of them. We have here as well as a promising approach is the HUD Section 108 program that allows communities to leverage their community development block grants for larger upfront investments in green infrastructure. And so there's more details on these in the toolkit and additional resources available that are linked out in our library as well. And we can put the links to those resources in the chat. And just two more elements, because I want to save time for questions here, of the toolkit to highlight today. So it's often crucial for communities to make the case that long-term capital investments in these localized options is really the appropriate thing to be doing. And a key element of making that case is the concept of intergenerational equity. This is the idea that water infrastructure costs should be borne by both current and future ratepayers because the benefits of those investments are enjoyed by both. And the primary vehicle for advancing intergenerational equity is really that public borrowing that spreads the costs out over time. And usually this takes the form of municipal bonds or other low-cost capital like the SRFs that we've been talking about. And spreading the costs out over time can also help reduce rate impacts and rate increases, and matches the benefits with the costs, all those multiple benefits with the costs. That is a really important accounting principle to follow. And again, there's more resources on intergenerational equity in the toolkit and links out to more resources from the library. And lastly here, as part of making the case for these long-term investments, you'll also need to navigate some unique legal, accounting, and tax questions. So I won't get into all of those for the sake of time, today, but just to note that the toolkit, what are my financing options section, does provide in-depth resources and answers on those questions. So with that, I'm gonna pause here on the toolkit explanation and ask our panel to field some of these questions. I know we put some resources in the Q&A box in response to Danielle's question, but I think some folks may have some additional thoughts about this. So Danielle asked, how do you get projects included in the IUP in the first place? And Shada, you addressed this a little bit, but any other thoughts on that? Yasmin, Shannon?
I was just going to say, I started writing a reply, but figured it would be easier here. So ultimately, projects that end up on the intended use plan come from water systems, water utilities that pull together a project application to the administering agency. The agency has their review process, which incorporates things like consideration of disadvantaged communities or affordability criteria. And then they put out what is called their intended use plan, which is basically their work plan for the year, how they plan to distribute those funds. Within there's the project prioritization list, which is the projects that they intend to fund. So backing up to how you get a project on the intended use plan, as an advocate community member, to my mind, it really goes to engaging with and building relationship with your water system or utility, and being a part of that decision-making process, which is one of the recommendations that we made for the local level. It doesn't happen nearly as often as you would think. It's a bit of a black box. It's a bit of a technical process, but I think at the local level, it really goes to that relationship building and having a voice in identifying the project need, and then utilities incorporating that in their application. In terms of actually getting on the IUP and the project prioritization list, I think that goes to some of the state and administrative barriers. So whether or not the affordability criteria, disadvantaged communities criteria as they're defined accurately represent the needs of the community, different formulas that they have in place for identifying which projects should be prioritized. There's a lot of detail that we could go into, but essentially, I think those are the two avenues. And then there's also engagement as the intended use plan is released, and reactions to what's included during the public comment period that Yasmin talked about. I don't know if others have anything to add.
I'll just add, and as maybe a nuts and bolts example, because we're doing some work in Colorado to support applications to get on the intended use plan, and some funding from the Colorado SRF. So every year they send out an email that says, fill out our eligibility survey, that in order to get on that path that Shada was saying, to apply for the SRF dollars and get on the IUP, the very first thing you have to do is fill out that eligibility survey. And that lets them know that you're interested, you want to be included in the process. It's not a commitment of any kind, but each state likely has a similar approach, that you've got to watch out for the emails, and those are those administrative hurdles that Shada's mentioning. But finding out what your state processes are, we put that link in the chat where the Southwestern EFC has compiled all of the various links that are out there, which are not easy to find, definitely, as a starting place. So that's what I'll add for now. Any other thoughts on that? Well, I see that we have 1 minute left, and I know we answered some of the other questions in the chat, but maybe I'll just wrap us up here. And I didn't see that O&M question, Yasmin, that you're bringing up. Oh, here.
Yeah, I see it. I don't have a good answer for it, but it is a good distinction to make, that it is correct that SRF funds do not cover operations and maintenance.
Yes, that's true. Shannon, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say, I know it's not the comprehensive, robust answer that I think the person asking would like to hear. But I do think, you know, for example, like in that City of Westminster example, it's worth noting that the direct installation was in partnership with Mile High Youth Corps, a community-based group. So I do think community partnerships can help expand capacity, but maybe they're not going to get you the whole way there. Also, I know for many of the smaller underserved communities, they may already be partnering with RCAC, but in, you know, working with circuit riders to be able to understand the localized systems, I also know it is something that a lot of smaller communities really depend upon.
Yes, absolutely. And from the localized infrastructure perspective, I'll just add that sometimes it takes some re-envisioning of what O&M is versus a capital cost, because planting a tree and establishing it in the first 3 years, viewing that as an O&M may not be actual O&M. It may be a construction cost that is not exactly comparable to putting a pipe in the ground that you put it in and then you're done, you're ready to maintain it as soon as it's in there. So there are some nuances to consider. All right, well, I want to say thank you to our panel. I know one of us has to drop off, so feel free to, if you need to do that. Three quick reminders. We have our August webinar. We hope you'll sign up for that. We hope you'll consider applying for the Transformative Water Leadership Academy. Applications are due the 15th of September. And we hope that you'll join WaterNow. It's open to local utility and city leaders. It's free, and membership provides additional resources and other benefits. So again, thank you to our excellent panelists and for you all for joining us today. We hope what we shared with you will be useful to you in your work. Thank you so much.